Okay, so thanks everyone for coming to our panel on race in Singapore. Can we have race without racialization? I'm very glad to see all of you here today, and in some ways this is a continuation of our really interesting and feisty discussion this morning about Singapore values and identity. So today we're going to be asking the very fundamental and important question, does Singapore have a race problem? The answer is yes. Okay, now that that's over with, how do we deal with the race problem in Singapore? Okay, discrimination was part of the human condition. So of course, in Singapore, the PAP government has dealt with racial discrimination and inequality by really essentializing and institutionalizing colonial racial identities. And it's at this point where we've got a certain set of stereotypes. But of course, this has also been criticized as being very limiting. People cannot actualize themselves, cannot achieve the full extent of the racial identities, and very limiting. And also, it does not allow for hybridity. And also the whole notion of, the whole point of having these racial identities is for meritocracy and racial equality, but the government is again accused of promoting a very sort of majoritarian Chinese identity. So, to discuss all these issues today, we've brought together this panel, and it's a very Singaporean panel because a Chinese provided the money, an Indian did all the work, and a Malay is here to legitimize the proceedings. So, speaking...
He's not even Malay. He's Indian Muslim.
Oh, okay, Muslim is here, Sorry, those are synonymous in Singapore in some way. I suppose, again, an issue with how race is perceived. Okay, so speaking today, Sangeeta Tharapal is a social media activist engaged in anti-racism work in Singapore. And she recently became famous in Singapore for originating the term Chinese privilege and initiating an online conversation on racism in the country. Her work focuses on applying concepts of critical race theory to the Singapore context. She was recently interviewed by the peer-reviewed journal Boundary 2 on Chinese privilege, gender, and intersectionality. And she's also started a petition to reinstate 527 as a holiday in Singapore. We also have Viswa Sadasivan, whom you have seen earlier, CEO of Strategic Moves, and also former nominated Member of Parliament. And finally, Zainal Abidin Rashid, who is currently non-resident ambassador to Kuwait and was an elected MP for 10 years in Algeria GRC, but lost the seat in 2011. So we're going to basically allow each speaker to speak for about 5 minutes as an opening statement, and then after that we will have time for responses to each other and then open the floor to questions. So,
good morning, and thank you for coming. So in Singapore, basic constructions of race really center around the CMIO model, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. And it's basically a holdover from the colonial era. It has its roots in the colonial census classification system. So one of the issues of this roundtable is how colonial identities have contributed to continued racialization. So during the colonial era, Singaporean ethnic minorities are racialized in very particular ways, or were racialized in very particular ways. The Malays were tolerably industrious as boatmen, fishermen, and policemen. The Indians make themselves generally useful as their mediocre abilities allow, but they quarrel loudly and vociferously. Malay women lounge about houses, cleaning fish, pounding rice, but do not care for work. This is a direct quote from Hussein Alatas, who wrote The Myth of the Lazy Native. So racialization is the discursive production of racial identities, and these colonial attitudes, I think, have become institutionalized in modern Singapore. Malays are racialized as lazy, backwards, unwilling to work hard, and Indians as uncouth, vulgar, and aggressive. And one of the ways that the government does this is by racialized statistics. Education is racialized. Academic progress is seen through the lens of race, not class. Malays are often accused of being underachievers. There are racialized statistics on drug usage that is supposedly a Malay problem, and this stretches back years. Even health is racialized. The Straits Times has reported how Malays are prone to obesity due to their food and habits. This kind of racialization happens with Indians as well. Besides being supposedly predisposed to diabetes, There are reports on how statements, and there are Straits Times reports with statements about how Indians are predisposed to, Indian men especially, to domestic violence due to their drinking habits. We see this racialization in the state reactions to the Little India riots, which resulted in the alcohol ban throughout Little India. And it was repeated yet again this year with Thaipusam, when processionals defied police guidelines on playing music, which ended in altercations between the two sides. The police released a statement blaming the men of having been drunk, but these men vehemently deny it, as well as bystanders. But it really doesn't matter because Indian men have been racialized as violent drunkards for so long that it was possible for the police to obfuscate their own role in the incident by playing on these existing stereotypes, knowing that the public will find it easy to believe. So while Indian and Malays have their health and other problems blamed on their innate ethnic traits and culture, Chinese health problems are not. Chinese women have weight problems, especially with anorexia. Chinese apparently have the highest cancer rate in the country, but these statistics are not racialized. There are no Straits Times articles about how their culture and their diet might be possible factors for their health. Instead, Chinese people in Singapore are racialized as hardworking, industrious, and the reason for Singapore's economic success. So this kind of cultural deficit theory, where racial traits or racial mindsets as resulting in poor education, low social mobility, violent behavior, are used against Malays and Indians, and they become public policy. And so we get policies where Muslims aren't allowed to hold high-ranking positions in the army, they are racialized as unpatriotic terrorists, we have special assistance plan schools, language policies, employment policies, which ask minorities if they can speak Mandarin in order to get a job. We have race-based immigration policies that further numerically disadvantage Malays. Racialization is dangerous because we never get to be represented as people in our own right, as complex human beings. We are strict about our individuality. It constantly reminds us that we are race first. We are not teachers, writers, or bankers. We are Indians and Malays first, no matter what else we are. It leads to the systemic dehumanization of entire groups of people who are already historically subjugated. It leads to state policy that is enacted based on these racialized beliefs because these policies are then justified through racialization. And lastly, it leads to a lack of systemic help for people due to the belief in these inherent cultural traits. If it's your fault that you didn't do well in school or life, then the state is under no obligation to help you or change the system that led to this. Instead of focusing on a system that has and continues to fail the poor and disadvantaged, we focus on individual achievements and the myth of meritocracy. So, Etienne Balibar says that the function of racialization is normalization and exclusion, where the target is no longer the Malay or the Indian, because that's not politically correct anymore, but instead it's the lazy Malay and the violent Indian. And the point of this, of course, is to be able to say and do racist things and get away with it, to just empower ethnic minorities and enact racist policies against them and be justified in doing so by calling it an innate cultural problem. So I believe the reason these things are seen through race rather than class is because I think breaking down these statistics by class shows that it is those of a lower socioeconomic background who tend to actually have these problems with health, education, etc. This would then make it a failure of state policies, but by making it about race, the state can make it about individual failures, thus devolving itself of any kind of responsibility. Thank you.
You know, in Singapore, my family, on several occasions when we go back and we say, on the way home, there was an accident and this poor chap, motorcyclist, was killed. The first question asked is Indian. You know, and for the life of you, can't understand what difference it makes whether the chap who died or was seriously injured was Indian, Chinese, Malay. I think this is highly symptomatic of the outcome of racialization, where consciously or unwittingly we have become a nation where racial identity is actually very important. We may deny it, but we may not articulate it, but it is in our consciousness. Because from young, many of us have been raised to talk about race. You know, it is at the dinner table and so on. It's not even racism, it's not about racism, it's just continuous discussion, reference to a person's race, a person's ethnic identity, and so on. Now, if you look at some of the legacy issues, right? When Singapore was accepted into into the new Federation of Malaysia. One of the conditions laid by the then Prime Minister Tunku was that Singapore will not challenge Articles 152 and 153 of the Federal Constitution, which safeguarded the special rights of the Malay community. Right? Now, as soon as we became part of the merged entity, the Singapore leaders started questioning whether it was necessary for that extent of special rights to be accorded to the Malays. Right? In June of 1965, there was a solidarity convention held at the then National Theatre in Singapore, where the chief ministers of the non-Bumi dominated states were invited to Singapore, and finally speeches were made, asking for a Malaysian Malaysia, not a Malay Malaysia, not a Chinese Malaysia, not an Indian Malaysia, but a Malaysian Malaysia. So the state multiculturalism then was introduced very clearly that as a state, we believe in multi-racialism and multiculturalism, right? Which is really what the pledge is about, the Singapore Pledge. Now, over time, some of the policies, unfortunately, appeared to be sending a very different signal. Don't forget, in Singapore, it was very, very clear, looking at Malaysia's experience in politics. Singapore said, we will not allow communal-based parties. No communal politics. No, so that's the reason why we don't have the equivalent of YUMNO, MCA, MIC. We don't have that, right? So that's what we stood for. But over time, some of those ethos started shifting, perhaps in the name of pragmatism. And one of the things that really needs to shift, I feel, is what appears to be the guidelines that Lee Kuan Yew highlighted, which I still believe holds. Number one, that the racial proportions should not be altered, not significantly. Why? Because it is linked to the genetic attributes of the races. And it's interesting why we have chosen to use the word race, which is more biological a term than ethnicity. Right? So, Chinese are economically a lot more able and driven economically, and Singapore's survival is predicated on continued economic growth. Therefore, we need the majority to be Chinese, otherwise economic growth is going to be affected. Again, it's not a racist, I don't believe it was racist, but it was a pragmatic calculation, right? Now, there was this argument, if Singapore was to be 75% Indian, there would be a lot of fractious and what's the term? Fractious and contentious. Indians have been described as fractious and not too far from the truth. I can say it, it's not racist. If you say it, it's racist. Okay? But you see, there's a lot of that going on. So what he's saying does not, you see, anecdotally, it's people smile because there appears to be some evidence of truth to it. Okay? By the way, where's my scotch? I'm Indian. Right? So there are all these jokes that come up. But the reason why it is very dangerous is because it has a certain semblance of anecdotal evidence. And then, that's a dangerous thing. If it's completely ludicrous, that's okay. And then you have, so the sense is Singapore needs to maintain the racial proportions. Now that means, that results in a whole series of other policies, like immigration policies, right? The replacement policies, all of them are like that. And the other thing that is very hot news today, a lot of people in Singapore are thinking about is this notion that Singapore is not, and perhaps for a long time will not be ready for a non-Chinese Prime Minister. These questions and statements made by people in very senior positions legitimize state multiculturalism that is very different from what was professed in 1965.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that story about the accident. In fact, just before coming to KL, I also, in my former constituency, I came across an accident. Motorbike had hit a car, and I stopped my car and just went to see. But race never featured in my mind then. I saw a Chinese driver for the car and a motorbike motorcyclist. Looks like a Chinese. So I approached him, and I wanted to get his phone number to inform his family. Then he gave me a Assalamu alaikum. I was a bit surprised. He looked very Chinese. And then I took his number, and then he said his phone was spoiled, so he had to call his girlfriend. But to me, would I have done it if he was a Chinese? Or was there close affinity because he was Muslim, he was Malay? But that brings me to the question of stereotypes. How would you have seen Malay, Indian? I was here to represent Malays. My origin from South India, my parents, my ancestors, culturally very Malay. But to add to the complexity, my grandmother was from Cantonese from Hong Kong. You'll never believe it, right? I'm not as fair as PJ, but you will see that I'm fairer in other ways. That's a joke.
It's a PAP kind of joke.
Couldn't resist that. Yeah. When we can joke about such things, we say that we are all right. So talking about racism, I always believe that history is a good guru. But I also realize now that history, we got to understand history to know the past, but the future is something else. Our generation is quite different from our children's generation. Whenever I talk about my grandfather's stories or about race, my children will say, please, enough of the grandfather's stories, we are Singaporeans, let's not talk about race. But I keep reminding myself, I was almost killed in racial riots in 1964 in Singapore. And when the thing broke up, color was the only consideration. And even Indian looks like Malay, he's also fall victim to ravaging Chinese youth then. Similarly, I had an anecdote when I came back and was almost killed in the accident. But when I went from a Chinese area to a Malay area, I saw the reverse. Malays hammering trishaw pullers and fruit sellers who used to be friends, and where just senses got out the window and because of color. So, can you repeat? If you look around the world, look around the region, the dangers are still very, very real. In 1969, when racial riots broke in Malaysia, I was in campus then, and I had to advise one of my friends, an entertainer during one of the bash in Union House, said, don't go back home first because racial riots have broken out in Malaysia, and you're passing to Chinese area, it's very dangerous. 1969. And what happened in Malaysia could easily have spillover effect in Singapore. What happened in Indonesia during the financial crisis when the Indonesians attacked Chinese homes and burned down Chinese homes, tensions were very high in Singapore. So our region, we're all interconnected. Race is a factor in the region, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Philippines. So I think Singapore is vulnerable too. So, but strangely, I've never seen race in the context of how it was described just now, in terms of the colonial classification. I saw it more in practical terms. Thanks. I got my reminder earlier. But race is a factor. Race is a very core factor in terms of determining what kind of multiracialism we want in Singapore. And at the launch of Kishore Mahbani's book on Can Singapore Survive, multiracialism or multiracial harmony was said to be one of the core factors by Professor Tony Koh. He mentioned, of course, the quality of Singaporeans we have, the governance, multiracialism, and our relationship with our region, with our neighbors. And they were all very optimistic. But I, for someone who have been struggling and trying to do all we can to make sure that racial harmony continues to be preserved and nurtured and enhanced, I also have my doubts sometimes whether in fact it can be sustainable over a long period of time. In good times, when the cake is growing, it can be shared by all easy. But in bad times, when the economy is going to shrink, when people in the lower rung of the skills and education, like Malays, will feel first the pinch of economic cake shrinking, what will it be like? Will the accusations about marginalization, discrimination come back in? Which I think is also resurfacing now in Singapore. So race is a real issue, and the dangers are still there, and we need to really have a good understanding how actually race contributes to that harmony and how we should go about promoting that sense of harmony among us.
Thank you very much. If I can begin actually by asking a really simple kind of stupid question. Say I just came over from Mars, I've got green skin, and I come to Singapore, and then I hear all of you saying race, and I see your identity cards as race. So I ask, what is race? What is race? Stay on the Mars. What is race? Alien, humanoid, please tell me. What would you say?
I think if a Martian were to ask me that question, I say you should watch our F1. That's a different kind of race.
Another baby.
No, seriously, I mean, Martian asking that question.
What is race?
Yeah, so on the most serious note about race, I think a Martian will not understand even if I was to answer. But a Malaysian will understand. But a Malaysian will understand it differently, more differently than how we Singaporeans will see it.
Well, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
asking you,
Yeah.
if you had to explain race from nothing, from no context whatsoever, how would you explain how Singaporeans or how you personally see race?
The way I described, in fact, that we are all born different in the sense of Malays, Indians, and Chinese, and there are different practicalities of problems or issues. And I don't know how many of you realize that, for example, Chinese, for example, who becomes a Muslim.
Sorry, what's a Chinese?
Straight at you asking me that question.
Yeah, my skin is green. I mean, so,
Oh, the
all of
Martian.
you.
You're going back to the Martian again. Yeah.
So sorry, human, you're trying to explain to me what is Chinese,
But
Malay.
why are you asking this question? Isn't it hypothetical? When we're talking about the realities on the ground, where we have our own concerns, our own issues, our own practical problems to handle, and we understand better, why do we have to worry about a Martian asking that?
Well, the point is, what are those practicalities? How would you define?
No,
You can't define a problem.
let me
address
give you
it?
another example.
That's what I'm saying. How do we define
I've spoken about the racial riots, right? You know the background. In Singapore, we've changed the constitution to have a GRC. That's a race conservation. Because the fears that because of 75% Chinese population, that the Malays will get outvoted and will not get fair representation in parliament. We changed the housing policy because we want to ensure that Malays don't just end up ghetto into areas like Geylang Serai, and then they will not be able to integrate in the whole community. That's a policy down from the government to the people. There's another policy where the Malay leaders themselves ask government to stop taking Malay students in schools once they reach 25% because the Malay leaders want the Malay children to be fully integrated into the whole society of Singapore. So that's how we saw the question of race and the effects it had on society.
what distinguishes,
I don't think you want me to go talk.
Define this problem.
I don't think you want me.
Is it just self-identification? If I say I'm a Malay, am I a Malay?
I spoke about the accident. I saw a Chinese-looking guy who's a Malay.
Yeah.
So there are problems, there are kind of issues, but yeah. So, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I follow the line of your question. But you try.
I'll save my question. I will say, just as you, in his language, I'll say you are green. Obviously, there are certain genetic reasons why you've got these physical characteristics, right? Similarly, you will find that there are people who look different, right? We don't all look the same. There are.
You look the same to me.
Yeah, and then you're a gundu. Okay? If you're green, you see. Yeah, exactly. No. Actually, Martians are supposed to be quite smart. You're a gundu Martian. Which is very different. No, basically, you can see that a Chinese looks very different from a white person. I mean, there are differences. So basically, to say it, there are certain genetic differences that make us different, but there are even more similarities that we have that make us human. So I will draw a distinction between human and all these things, and then maybe use the analogy to say, just as you have different kinds of furniture that is made from different kinds of wood, that comes from different kinds of trees, right? So similarly, you have different shades of people and types of people, but there is one thing that unifies all of us, which you will see if you observe very carefully. They are called human traits and frailties. He may not understand frailties, so I may have to say in Tamil.
I understand the language, but it's the concepts. So race, is it largely based on how you look then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I were to explain it to, thank you, if I was to explain it to a Martian, that's probably how I would say.
If I have plastic surgery, can I change my race?
Not really, because race is also not just physical.
Right.
There are also certain other characteristics that you may have, which,
Such as?
I don't know, maybe besides, I'm not going to say that Indians are fractious and complex. I wouldn't want to go there. Not those things. I'm just going to say there may be certain other biological differences. For example, if you look at the Caucasoid race, right? Generally speaking, over time, they've evolved into having larger bones. The bone structure is much bigger, right? Then the Negroid can also be. So what I'm saying is there are also other genetic structural shifts, structural changes that come with race. But why do I want to waste my time telling a Martian all these things?
You're the first human to ever meet a Martian, and he's asking you, trying to understand.
Okay, can I start, Mr. Zan? What should I call you? Zaino? Okay, no Mr. in front. Okay, just in case. I don't want to piss off an ambassador. He might not let me in Kuwait at some point. Okay, so Zaino said something earlier about how, I'm going to get to your question, PJ, I just want to, about GRCs and how they're there because it might vote minorities out. I think these kinds of things are really interesting because people don't really interrogate the assumptions behind them. So when you say that, if that is the justification of GRCs, what the government is really saying is that Chinese people in Singapore are racist. That no matter how well educated and great for the job a Malay person is, because of the fact that they are Malay and not Chinese, Chinese people will not vote for them. And I think that's really weird, and that's okay, that's okay for people to say, because in other countries it is not okay for people to say these things. But in Singapore, you can say it, you can make it policy, you can justify it, and then you can spend the next 40 years keeping yourself in power by doing it. It's just crazy to me that people can say these things, and like I said, I think that the assumptions here are that Chinese people are racist, which honestly, I don't think is entirely true all the time. Now, getting back to PJ's question, the term race, according to sociologists and anthropologists, is an entirely socially constructed thing. It's not actually real. It's actually categorization. It's how people and groups perceive you, and how you are perceived by other people, by social institutions, by groups really. For example, being black in America as a race has to do with slavery, incarceration, media images, Jim Crow, housing discrimination, social institutions. It's basically how social institutions perceive you. And racial categories are really about like how the world sees you and has seen you and will treat you and people who look like you over a period of time. Yeah, of course, some people, I mean, we all share particular, like South Indians, some people kind of brown, but you know, I mean, South Africans are kind of brown sometimes, Latin Americans are kind of brown sometimes. This idea that there is one thing that people of a particular race share is just really weird, because at some point or other, someone else in the world will share that trait as well. And if it is a mixture of traits, whether it's physical or otherwise, that makes you who you are, then that's kind of weird as well, because then we're just really like dismissing the role of like society and community and socialization that has on you and why you behave in a particular way or talk in a particular way or do particular things. So I think race is entirely constructed.
Either of you want to respond to that?
Well, I can see where you're coming from in terms of GRC being weird, but when we have a situation where, in fact, politics is such where there are serious concerns on certain groups of being left out of representation, then it's a different issue. It's not because we're saying that Chinese are racist, but I think the Chinese are also practical-minded people. And if you have two equal candidates of background, academic background, but one can speak my language, the other doesn't speak my language, the other is also maybe worse, maybe he's a Muslim, what kind of mindset he has. So that will affect the kind of way we vote. Then if you go on that kind of voting pattern, then you may result. I mean, yeah, it's fully democratic, full rights and independent way of choosing things. But does it bring about stability? Will you have a parliament, let's say, out of 75, and you have 73 all Chinese? I think there are practical constraints, and I think to avoid the situation, that's why it was initiated. But as I said earlier session, we can debate. People accuse government of trying to do that because they want to make it more difficult political position. But the basic cause was to make sure there's a fair and fair representation of people in parliament.
Could I comment on that? I agree with Zainal in the sense that if it's supposed to, if the intention is to ensure that because of certain voting patterns, you could end up in a situation where minority candidates don't get voted. If that's a consideration, there's a logic to it. But my concern, my problem with GRC and the argument behind GRC is the more you articulate a negative, the more it becomes the truth. You see what I mean? The more people of authority articulate that Chinese will vote Chinese, you actually will start having a certain assimilative effect on the ground. People will start being conditioned by the rhetoric. And there's the danger of that. Second, when are we going to be old enough as a society to take a chance on ourselves? To say, no, otherwise we are continuing to engineer. A society that continues to engineer, whether it's multiculturalism or anything else, or relationships, will not make progress. Because you will continue to seek approval from the person who is doing the engineering, right? At some point, you probably will start, you have a population that seeks permission before you act on procreation. You know what I'm saying? It's almost as if we continue to want to get permission before we do something. When are we going to trust our own instincts as human beings? I think we have come a long way since 1959 and 65. We've come a long way. We just need to have a lot more faith in ourselves. I can tell you honestly, the notion that Singapore is not ready for a non-Chinese Prime Minister, a lot of people in Singapore think is outdated. Seriously outdated. And the dangerous thing is it legitimizes a certain racist orientation. And that is a very dangerous thing coming from the state, even though that may not be the intention. And I am fairly confident if, for example, Tharman was to be, Tharman Shanmugaratnam's name is to be put up as a candidate for Prime Minister, the vast majority of Chinese in Singapore would vote for him, simply because they're also pragmatic. They know that this man will deliver. They're not going to vote for him because they want to prove that they are not racist. That's not the reason. They'll vote for him because they believe that he's the right man for the job. So if you truly believe the Chinese are pragmatic, if that's one's argument, then if you put up a good person, he'll get voted. But we need to start taking a chance on ourselves. Otherwise, all these policies will end up being a crutch. And when does a person get rid of the crutch or become confident enough to walk without the crutch?
So that is a question of time, right? Do we agree? Then it's a question of time, it's a question of process, question of evolution. Do you agree at that one time there was this real danger or risk? So we need that system. So how do we change the system is the question. Whether it's right now or whether it's later is anybody's guess. So it's a question of taking risks. Yeah, we take risks, but taking a risk to what point? Taking a risk, changing government is one thing. Taking a risk where it may result in greater loss of Malay sense of confidence and feeling part of Singapore is something which I don't want to take risks with. So I think I agree totally that it's a question of time and a question of process. Taman, I agree.
I should point out that the the Legislative Assembly of 55 to 59 was almost half minority, and the first two PAP governments, the 59, 63 and 63, 68, also have a high proportion of minorities than the current, since the GRCs were created. So it seems to imply that under a freer democratic system, Singaporeans would happily vote in non-Chinese, so to speak. And of course, our first Chief Minister, David Marshall, came from one of Singapore's smallest communities. So I find it very interesting that you're talking about things in terms of a lot of social, you address the issue as a social one, but the two of you look at it very much more as a political issue. And can I interrogate that a bit? How much of our racial problem is also a political one, given our history, the manipulation of race in Singapore and in Malaysia for political ends? Because let's be frank, race has been manipulated in both countries for very political ends, particularly for the issue of merger, right? The Tunku did not want his voter base shrunk. If Singapore reunited with the rest of Malaya, there would be more Chinese than Malays in the Federation. So, he brought in Borneo, but he also then put all these conditions. And Lee Kuan Yew sought to use that fear against him by saying there was a Chinese problem that needed to be dealt with, and really pushed, beat that drum relentlessly till Tunku. So my question is, how much of this is a politically constructed issue given Singapore's historical, political context, the fact that we have a government that is led by English-speaking Chinese and needed to prove themselves to non-English speaking and non-Chinese in Singapore, to contrast themselves with Malaysia, and are we constrained at all by that regional context, or at least the Malaysian context?
Frankly, I don't think Singapore has played the race card as directly as perhaps Malaysia has. What I see in Singapore is that we have evolved as a society to be a lot more cosmopolitan and Western in our thinking and our logic. That's where I see a desync. The very people who talk about race are actually quite Anglophile in their orientation. They're trained in the UK, they're trained to think in Western logic, and today there are a lot of people in Singapore who are Western trained. Even if it's, I don't mean studied in Europe or America, but Western trained in the way we think, the logic. Right? So if you ask me, the real dichotomy in Singapore is between, not among the races. People don't look very much as, you're Chinese and so on. Of course, we know the differences, right? But it's really about whether you are educated or not. By educated, it means Western education. That's really what it means. I'm saying that's the thinking, right? Which is not healthy. So we're now having, at one point, it may have been horizontal along racial lines. Now it's more vertical. Okay, it's more class, right? You can have foreigners coming in. You can have mainland expats, you can have Indian expats coming in, but they don't have a problem hanging out with people of the same socioeconomic class. You see what I mean? You see the expat Indians, for example, mainly in the financial sector, they hang out among a select group of Singapore Indians of the same ilk, of the same socioeconomic class. So you're seeing a different kind of thing. Across races, by the way, it's more class. The clustering is a lot more class. So for me, this is where the missing is. We are becoming a lot more class stratified, but our rhetoric is still race. I think a lot of Singaporeans have moved beyond race, and we are more conscious of the class stratification. That's my view.
Can I just interject you? Then are you agreeing with Sangeeta? Because it seems like we're moving away from biology towards social, you keep using social economics. Isn't that then a social construction?
I wouldn't even dichotomize these things, I mean, frankly, I'm not a student of any of these, but my point here is simply my own observations, okay? Now, I'm not for one moment saying that it's all about race. You forced me to ask you how I would talk to a Martian, and I attempted an answer. But at the end of the day, I strongly believe that we should not over-racialize society. Some of these differences, my point is, some of these differences are there, but we need to acknowledge those differences, not deny those differences. Acknowledge those differences and don't give too much of importance to those differences. It's not about saying, I'm colorblind, everybody is the same. We are not. We are all different people, right? For me, there's nothing wrong in acknowledging that there are differences, but don't give too much of importance to those differences and move on. So I don't think there's a contradiction in what I'm saying. I'm saying race, for me, is a reality. Physical and other differences are a reality. But I feel as a society we are giving it too much of importance, right? When actually the rhetoric has shifted from this, if you ask me, to socioeconomic class.
So much to say. So yes, race is a social construction, but that doesn't mean that the material consequences of being treated as a particular race aren't true. So I think obviously there are real life effects of people and the policies that are aimed at particular types of people. So this argument, Mr. argument that it is we're moving towards class and not race, is quite interesting to me because I think it seems to believe that race and class are not intertwined, but they completely are. I mean, who's of the lowest socioeconomic class in Singapore? It's Malays. Who has the lowest amount of education in Singapore? It's Malays. And this directly contributes to their marginalization. So to say that it's more class than race is not true because race and class are completely intertwined in the country. Not that there aren't any poor Chinese people. Of course there are lots and lots of poor Chinese people. But it's not always just about class. I agree with him, it's not always just about race. But I think it's too simple to say that it's about class and not really race because any small amount of studies into the kind of statistics that we have in Singapore will show you that Indians and Malays are of the lowest socioeconomic class in the country. So, is there anything else I want to say? I don't know, I forgot your question by the time we made the round.
Is it a political issue?
Yes, definitely. I think race is definitely a political issue. I mean, I'm not the Singapore government. I don't believe that politics, the political, the social, and the economic are different things. I think they're one and the same. I mean, I think the price of bread is political, I think that the price of housing is political. I think the price of cars are political. I think everything is political because it is. It's about defining how you live your life and deciding what choices and opportunities and access to power that you have. So I think race is completely political. It is politicized in Singapore as well, and it's used by the PAP if and when it needs to use it, and then it is used by the PAP when it wants to deflect responsibility from having to help marginalized groups. So I think it is all three. I think it's social, it's economic, and political.
I think it's all in political, sociological, class, and economics. In the case of Singapore, yes, Malays in the lower rung, In fact, from what I was told, for the Indians, the top class of the Indians, they are even better than the national Chinese. But the lower class of the Indians becoming worse than the Malays. You know, that's what I gather. So, yeah, I mentioned earlier, when I talk to my children's generation, they say, don't talk about race. We are all Singaporean. But you find that some Malays, 6 months down the road after graduation, they can't get a job. Then slowly you creep to them, is it because I'm Malay? Is it because of Mandarin policy? Is it because color? Or is it because of Islam? You will dawn on that. So their race and their ethnicity will come back to them and say, yeah, I'm Singaporean, but look at this. And you ask in the Indian community, how many of the Indians, I think a significant number feel they are marginalized too in Singapore. So it's also a race factor. So another anecdote I'd like to share with you, but this again history, because things are changing. There was a time when the Chinese stream, as against English-educated Chinese, they identified more with the Malays because they felt that they were being marginalized. And there were Chinese leaders, cultural, language, the Chinese leaders who came to see me when I was editor of Ritara and a community leader, and they said, why don't we work together? Our real challenge, our real enemy is actually the English-educated Chinese. I think some of you may still remember Tang Liang Hong in his election campaign was saying that the Chinese-educated Singaporeans are the ones carrying the silent chair with the English-educated Chinese riding it all the time. And what's worse, these English-educated Chinese are becoming more and more Christians. So even religion comes into factor, accusing that they are becoming more Christian, more Western, rather than Chinese, culturally Chinese. And that's why the emphasis on Mandarin to make sure that Singapore Chinese are also culturally rooted to their own culture.
Shall we take some questions? Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, gentleman in the back. No, you better use the mic.
I'm just curious. You've spoken about race and racialization, much in terms of like a top-down process. Are the panel aware of any emergent trends that might fracture the overarching narrative of race? As perhaps one example, or an obvious thing to say, you brought up the issue of class. Also in terms of discursive constructs of race, you're also talking about narratives of sexuality, heterosexuality, gender, etc., etc. We know that. Are you aware of any emergent trends, grassroots trends, that might shift or change this sort of top-down narrative?
That's precisely what I was trying to say just now, that the rhetoric seems to be shifting, or rather the realities are shifting, but we're sticking to the old rhetoric. It's not that they're mutually exclusive, but it's that maybe it's expedient to continue to talk about race, when actually we've moved on from there. Some people are still talking about race, but a lot of people are talking about shared interests. So you're talking about economic shared interests. You're talking about networking. Social media has become a huge catalyst in actually getting people from different shades of color, right, to come together because they've got a common goal, a shared interest. It could be a hobby, it could be a professional shared interest. So there are different reference points that are surfacing, right? So this whole notion of race, to me, is rather simplistic. Defining a population along racial lines per se is outdated and simplistic. And the reason why it must continue, it appears to be continuing to be given importance, could be because there's political mileage perhaps to be got from it. But my point is, it is not sustainable because the reality on the ground is changing so fast. I mean, if you look at the reality in Singapore, for example, in the last 8 years, there's a sudden surge in the influx of mainland Chinese immigrants and mainland Indian, from India, immigrants. Right? Now, before that, before this happened, we were really talking about multiracialism, as in the Chinese have their own ethos, the Indians have their own ethos, the Malays have their own ethos, and so on, and that we are separate communities, right? But the moment this influx happened from China and India, and they are very different from Singaporeans culturally, very, very different. I find it very difficult, Singapore-born Indian, I find it very difficult to relate to an Indian from India, who might be from the same socio-economic class as I find it very, and he may be speaking the same dialect or sub-ethnic language. I can't relate to him because culturally he's combative, right? He wants to win. We are culturally less combative in that sense. So it's very difficult. So you'll find a lot of Singaporean Chinese not liking the presence of mainland Chinese. You'll find a lot of Singaporean-born Indians who are probably the most critical in Singapore of their brethren who are from India. So what's happening is there's a lot more similarity between a Singapore-born Chinese and an Indian than a Singapore Indian and an Indian. You see what I'm saying? So the whole dynamics is shifting. People are beginning to see that there are common things that transcend race amongst us that exist, that perhaps politically we are still denying. And I'm not quite sure why.
I disagree almost like completely. I think talking about race is not divisive at all. I don't see why it has to be. I think people requiring you to homogenize yourself and assimilate yourself into whatever dominant majoritarian culture just in order for them to be able to you as human, that's problematic. We all come with certain cultures and traditions, and why should talking about that be in any way divisive? I actually think that to not talk about race is to not talk about racism, because we must. So Zainu was saying just now, what about educated Malays who feel like they are being discriminated? Guess what? They are. Okay, so when people go to interviews and, you know, I know women who wear tudungs and they've gone to interviews and they are asked about just how Islamic are they? So they are not being discriminated on the basis of their color, on the basis of the fact that they don't speak Mandarin. And even if they speak Mandarin, there are lots and lots of Indians in Singapore who learn Mandarin in order to be able to be more employable. They don't get hired either. So how do we deal with these kinds of systemic discrimination if we don't talk about race? In fact, I think the problem is not that we talk about race. I think it's that we don't talk enough about race. All our sedition laws, our laws that are meant to keep us quiet, right, has meant that we spent 4 generations not talking about the serious problems that we have with race in Singapore and with racism and the kind of systemic and systematic issues that we have. The fact that we couldn't get a permit to talk at Hong Lim Park about what happened at Thaipusam, about the fact that Thaipusam is not a holiday anymore, about the fact that that you can't play music at Thaipusam. I'm not so sure if the non-Singaporeans will get this reference, but yeah, so we can't talk about race, but we should. So the idea that we are talking about race and that we shouldn't, to me it's really weird because I feel like there's almost no conversations about race and racism in Singapore.
So actually, what is it about what I said that you disagree with? No, I'm just curious. Or are you just disagreeable? I don't understand. Because I never for one moment said that we shouldn't talk about race. So who were you disagreeing with?
You.
So,
Okay.
disagreeing with what?
Because you were saying that
I think, sorry, yeah, that was an implication that race we could transcend it.
No. But it didn't mean that I said we don't talk about race. I'm just saying that the markers are shifting. That's my observation. But at no point did I say we shouldn't talk about race. In fact, I strongly feel that we should talk more about race. So I don't quite understand why you keep saying you disagree with me and then you go on to say things that I actually want to say or I believe it.
Oh, okay.
No. So I just want to clarify. Is there something else that you saw in my language or what I said that you really disagree with?
No, but just from what you said just now, and the idea of us being on almost post-racial society, and I do recall you saying that we shouldn't be so interested about we shouldn't concentrate so much on race. Yeah, so I think we should actually. So we do disagree on that, Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay.
I thought there is debate about race. I mean, sometimes it's also half full or half empty. Yeah, there are Malay girls who get jobs in some places. But look at our Speaker of Parliament. Halimah Yacob was appointed. Not only she's a Malay, but she's also wearing a tudung. The Chinese Muslim wearing a tudung is the head of nanotechnology in A-Star, and he's featured prominently. So why is this discrimination? So I think sometimes, I mean, we know there are certain problems, certain companies, certain individuals who may have certain concern. She puts on tudung, does it mean more than just the headgear? But it's also she will not mix with people, she will not shake hands with people. So, and if a company, for example, depends on her to do PR job and interaction, of course it's a practical consideration. There will be those issues. So I think there are practical considerations, but if you look in Parliament, it's also discussed about Mandarin issue and steps taken by NTUC to make sure that those stereotyping about Mandarin is also taken care of, can be taken to court. Issues are being debated, issues are being discussed about race.
I think just because Barack Obama is the president of America doesn't mean that black boys are not being shot and killed in the street. Just because Bangladesh has had a woman president doesn't mean that Bangladeshi women are not being raped and killed. The existence of a few people who have made it, the existence of a few people of the minority who are there, doesn't mean that systematic racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these things don't exist. A few people do not mean, the fact that there are only a few people there should already say something.
But shouldn't the converse also apply? Just because there are few cases or many cases, just because if you've identified a few cases of blatant discrimination, does it mean that it is rampant? I mean, I'm not sure. Either way, we have to look at, see, I've served in the Singapore Indian Development Association for 20 years. I come across a lot of reports of discrimination by Indians, right? We investigate, we even proactively go down to the employer and ask those questions. And I can tell you, in many of these instances, we are not sure whether it's blatant racism. In other words, was the person not given the job primarily because of the color of his skin or her skin, or the race? No. A lot of those occasions were gray areas. I mean, I give you a specific example. There's this company for whom 90% of their clients are Chinese-speaking Chinese, right? Now, there was an Indian who went there, had the academic qualifications for the job, went for the interview, didn't get the job. We went back to the company and spoke to them. They said, we have a practical problem. We did need somebody who could speak Mandarin. Then we said, then why did you put it in the ad? They said, but there's so much pressure now. If we put an ad, we are under fire from Ministry of Manpower and so on. Why are you specifically asking for Mandarin speaking? So we decided not to. But that is so impractical, right? You make the person come all the way for the job, knowing very well that she is not suitable, right? Now, similarly, if you go down to the Bank of India branch in the heart of the city, business district, you go and tell me whether you can find one non-Indian teller. Why doesn't that come? And when I spoke, we spoke to the bank manager. They said there were Chinese Singaporeans who applied for the job. They didn't get the job simply because the job requires you to be able to speak at least one of the Indian languages, in particular Hindi or Tamil. So that was also racism, wasn't it?
Language.
No, but I mean, whatever you want to call it.
Chinese who could speak Hindi, would they have gotten the job?
I don't know. I mean, let's not split hairs. The point I'm saying is there is some kind of discrimination that took place there, right? You were discriminated either against on the basis of race or language ability, but the point was there was discrimination. What I'm saying is the whole issue of discrimination based on race, language, or religion is no more as easy to define in a multiracial society where you've got these different business dynamics and business realities. So I'm saying we should stand firmly against blatant racism. That means purely on the basis of your skin color or your race or your religion, I'm not admitting you into this area. I'm not allowing you to be a student in the law faculty because you're Indian, because we feel that Indians are fractious and contentious. And we don't want too many fractious and contentious lawyers. When that happens, that's discrimination. So I'm just offering a slightly different way of looking at it. You may not agree, but it is my view.
I agree with you that I think racism is very hard to prove, for sure. That's part of the problem. But you know all those times that Cinder went down and talked to these organizations, right? So did anyone ever come out and say, oh yeah, I didn't hire that guy. His skin was too dark.
So why do you assume that was the reason why you didn't hire?
But no one's going to actually say, yeah, that's why I didn't hire them.
No one says it, he's straight away guilty.
I didn't say that. I'm saying the fact that racism exists, I'm not so sure if you would even agree that it does exist actually at this point in time, but I think it does. I think that the fact that racism exists means that these practices exist. The fact that you couldn't find someone who would admit to it doesn't mean that they don't. I'm not saying that it happens all the time. I'm not saying that it is might even be the majority of the time. But no one, if you only are going to fight blatant racism, you're never actually going to do anything because no one's going to admit to being blatantly racist.
No one in this day and age, no one's going to admit I'm a racist, right? They're going to do it in very subtle ways. That's the point.
Okay, then what if the guy really was not racist in his decision? Are you going to?
Can I ask though, based on that? I mean, I have never heard of a major landmark race discrimination lawsuit in Singapore. Did I just miss it because I'm Chinese and therefore don't pay attention to these things? Have you ever sued an employer on behalf, and the broader question, how much do minorities in Singapore acquiesce in their treatment? How much of it is, because you agree and maybe because some of your leaders have become part of the establishment?
No. First of all, we've had several success cases where we've gone down, and it's not about litigation, it's not about taking them to court. Not everything needs to be done that way. But these companies are blacklisted automatically. We would make an official report to the Ministry of Manpower. They straight away blacklist them. That's even more painful than taking them to court. So, to answer your question, there have been several interventions that were successful. But when you intervene, you've got to be fair. You've got to try your level best to be as fair as possible for all sides. There are businesses that have serious business considerations that you need to be fair to as well. But would we be absolutely spot on in all our investigations? The answer is no. Precisely because we're dealing with an extremely grey area. So you have to exercise some form of judgment after careful study of all the facts and information that's available to you. Will anyone who has made a decision purely based on race tell you openly that, yes, I didn't hire him because of race? The chances are very slim. But is that the only way you can ascertain whether a decision was based on race? If you use a certain faculty called intelligence and deductive reasoning, you can actually surmise, even if the person does not confess, that the evidence proves clearly that a significant part of the decision was based on that. So, but that doesn't mean that you straight away assume that all the people who did not admit to not being racist were racist. That is a fallacious argument, and we need to be careful about that.
we are making progress. I'm very happy to see, in fact, some of the food outlets in Serangoon Road employing Chinese from China. Yeah. So I don't know whether to attract Chinese, but local Singapore Chinese also sometimes don't like to have Chinese from mainland China working in our coffee shops. That's another problem. So I think racism there is among some people, some quarters they may not openly say it, but it's not a policy. Government does not encourage it. Government has encouraged instead taking action against those who are found to be bordering even on whether it's language or race issues. So I think there is progress. If I may touch on this one issue of population, I think it's been discussed just now. From my own personal experience, when Singapore government first wanted to open up immigration to attract talent, in fact, the former Prime Minister came to see me, I was editor, to discuss with me. So I told him I can fully understand why we need to do that, but please make sure that the 15% Malays remain 15%. But he didn't have to worry about that. He promised that, but he didn't have to worry about that because the Malays were overproducing. Malays and Indians were on the average 4.6 at one time, those days. Chinese were declining from 2 to 1.4, 1.2, below the production rate. And because of 75% population Chinese, and the rate of attrition or non-reproductive of Chinese, that Singapore population will shrink, and the quality of us, the possibility of us attracting quality investment will be very much affected, which will then also affect the Malays and the Indians. So they even formed a task force to attract Malay talent. So I was a member of the committee. We went out. I went to South Africa, I went to Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, forget it. At that time, they thought the Malays in Singapore were just a second-class citizen. They will never come to work in Singapore. So it wasn't a solution. So it didn't help. But the government was so sensitive in looking at various perspectives of that. But the idea basically is economic concentration. How will Singapore economy continue to progress and attract investment and have the kind of quality labor that will be able to sustain that growth? So those were the kind of consideration that was put in. But of course, if I were to go just a step further, Chinese coming to Singapore, at first they thought it would be good for the hospitals because the majority of patients are Chinese, but it didn't work out because the Chinese from mainland China or Lao or Laos or whatever, and then they had to change that, cut that down and get more Filipinos. But as the number of Filipinos grew, they were very good first-class nurses, but as the number of Filipinos grew, they all became a bit loud themselves. They became so strong in numbers, they became a problem to the hospitals. And Indonesians, we wanted to take Indonesians, but there are a lot of sensitivities to Malaysians.
People wanting to ask
Yes.
questions.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's not. Okay.
I have mic, so I
Okay.
stay first here. I wing for the mic, so I got it. I just want to comment on a few things and ask a few questions. I'll try to be very quick. I think there is a need to differentiate between being colorblind or race blind and race neutral. Because if you're blind means you don't see it at all, if you're neutral means you see it, you acknowledge it, and then you're neutral towards it. And I think that's something that there was a little bit of that going on. And I do think that while it is a social construct, because of racialization throughout our history, there is a need to continue talking about race from an advocacy standpoint, right? Because, for example, I'll give you a very concrete example, and I'd like to hear some comments, is working with women in the sex industry, Singaporean women. There are a disproportionate number of Malay women and Indian women in the sex industry. Very, very few Chinese women are entering the sex industry now. And even for younger generations, we still see a lot of young Malay and Indian women joining the industry, but no more, not that I know of, Chinese women are still entering the sex industry. While I strongly believe sex work is work and should be legitimized, it is still a highly frowned upon industry to be in. So the other part of my question would be, so Hong Park, to not talk about race and religion is actually in the policy, right? It was not a one-time off for the Thaipsum protest. In the Public Order Act exemption, it says that if you were to talk about race and religion at Hong Park, you have to apply for a police permit, even though meant to be freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff. So I just want to hear people's comments about that particular policy as well as the Sedition Act. Yeah.
Okay, let's take a few questions. Can you bring the mic? Yeah.
Okay, one important word that hasn't been mentioned is eugenics. And Singapore has an explicit, quite explicit eugenics policy, which was firmly held by the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. And I think that has a great deal to do with the racialization. And even when I look at the most recent copy or edition of Singapore statistics, the Department of Statistics, which is supposed to be a numbers cruncher and nothing else, says things like the government of Singapore is committed to retaining the proportions of, why is the Department of Statistics saying something like that? It's really just an ideological statement. And all this thing about the racist policies and all that, it stems from eugenics. And it's not limited to race. It has to do with things like able-bodiedness and disability. It has to do with, and the whole educational system. I mean, if you don't do well in school, you've got stupid genes and things like that. And another thing about the eugenics is that
I think you made a point.
yeah, it says that once you're there, you're condemned, and that's why the whole educational system is kind of geared towards just filtering people out. And the point that PJ made about internalizing stereotype, I think is very important. Field research has shown, quite recent field research has shown that the Malays who do well internalize the stereotypes of, Malays being havoc and mudrock and so on, and they distance them. Their parents tell them, don't mix with other Malays. And then they themselves, what do? They then embrace a Muslim identity where they can be members of the global Ummah. I mean, so this is actually a source of all the recruits to religious extremism.
Thank you. One more question?
I don't know whether this is a question or is a mix of question and comment. Yeah, okay. I just would like to respond to what you just talked about, the social construction of race. I think there is an assumption that if you hold on to the idea of social construction of race, then you would you have a chance to talk about racialization without being racist, or there's such an assumption. Because even though you agree with the idea of that race is a social construction, it doesn't mean that the race problem will go away. Rather, from what I get from another two panelists, it seems that there's a lot of governmentality or even regulation of how race should be talked about in Singapore, rather than or even who can talk about race. Yeah, and I think it is because even if you want to the idea of social construction of race, you can still see race as something that is can be subjected to social engineering or even governmentality, to change how to form a nation, a whole new nation through de-racialization, or even through the state multiculturally, multi-race, multi-ethnicity, or I mean, race becomes a thing that the state wants to regulate. And my question is, how that affect people's everyday life? If there's this riot in Little India.
I think we got your point. How does that affect you? Okay, so we have several comments. Let's take one or two more questions. Questions, right? Instead of comments, specifically questions. Okay.
I wonder if the panel can agree how racist or not racist Singaporeans as a whole are. Bearing in mind, of course, it's a construct and so on, not just from anecdotal evidence. I say this because it seems that when you say that government thinks Singapore is not ready to talk about race so openly, but some people are advocating that we talk about race very openly. The issue here is that there's a difference in perception of Singaporeans' constructed racism. Can we agree on that? Thank you.
Okay, last one, Peter.
perhaps you dealt with this already because I came in halfway through, but there seems to be, and it's touched on by our friend who talked about the issue of the employment tribunal. Singapore has a very open policy, and indeed there's a political agenda to bring in lots of quote-unquote new Singaporeans, so people who are not homegrown, for political reasons, because obviously if Indians come and they do well, that they're not going to be critical of the government, and presumably that's also the same for those from mainland China. And I'm just wondering how far immigration policies in Singapore are affecting the issue of discussion of race or conceptions of race or issues which may be cross-cutting in which homegrown, homeborn Indians and Chinese are seeing a commonality in terms of their own political position.
So a lot of comments and questions there. Who would you like?
Yeah, maybe we can start with the last question. And that's, I've heard about that comment, whether in fact, even in terms of immigration, there's a political agenda to it. But that's not how I see it. I think basically the economic agenda, because I think government also realized that when it comes to the so-called possible political benefit, it has backfired to even with local Singaporeans. For example, when I was stood for election in the first term, we depended on the middle income. We thought that they have their properties, they won't want to rock the boat, only PAP can maintain that kind of property prices, so better have more middle income. And similarly, the Indians or the professionals, they will also want to preserve that. But in the second term when I went in fact, the whole thing swung. The middle incomes rebelled and they voted against the government because of policies to do with all kinds of housing, cost of living and others. So I don't think there can be, if I may use the word stereotyping, of that kind of political agenda, because things do change too. Other comments, religion, permits. I don't know how many of you really recognize the volatility and the sensitivity of religious and racial matters. Even in Malaysia, for example, debate about Allah, we can rationalize, intellectualize it, but at the ground level, it's seen very differently. So I think there's no kind of measure or control. I think it can be overplayed, and then it can create and evoke different sentiments from the ground. And once the fire is flared, it's difficult to control. But it can be abused. And so that's your concern. I think the kind of control, it can be abused, and we don't want that to be abused again for a political agenda. But coming from where I come from the Malay Muslim background, I think there are genuine concerns about that. There are already enough problems with these ICs and all the stereotyping about Malays and Muslim. But when people discuss issues about religion and race, I think it can touch on the wrong nerve. So I think some control I would also welcome.
I'm in favor of a lot more discussion, opening up the space for discussion on race and religion. But again, from my own experience, actually moderating these discussions, I've probably moderated about close to 50 of these discussions in various forums. I can tell you, it is one of the most difficult things. You're talking about 300 people, as small as 30 to as big as 300 people. You have people who come there with racist agenda to incite. Then you have a whole lot of people who react. Right? It's very primordial. And my sense is, because we're not used to talking openly about race, you need to be careful in doing it. Because people don't know how to conduct themselves. And it is hugely polarizing, and pluralistic. And you've got to be very careful about this. Because it ignites extremely fast. And I've seen it, okay? I've seen it. Now let me share one particular incident with you. I used to chair the feedback unit in Singapore, the discussions on politics. A group of 30 to 50 people, we meet for years, every month. And this particular occasion, there was this gentleman, Malay gentleman, who during the 2002 recession said he believed strongly that Malays were targeted for retrenchment. Now, I let the conversation go. I didn't want to intervene. I want to see how it goes. His best friend, who is a full professor of economics in one of the universities in Singapore, and they were best friends. This guy, this Malay gentleman, was a senior executive engineer in the Public Utilities Board. They educated people, right? The Chinese gentleman, who is Western educated, good friends, told him, this is the problem with you Malay people. When you should be studying in school, you don't study. Okay? You go and play the guitar. This came out. Now my point is, it is deeply embedded. Some of these racial stereotypes are deeply embedded because we have not had the chance to talk about it. It doesn't mean it's gone away. But what happened in the end was, there was a clear alignment of all the minority, ethnic minority people in the group. They were, even though they didn't agree with the Malay gentleman, they felt the need to align. So it became the minorities all against the Chinese. It resulted in a fist fight. It resulted in a fist fight between mature adults in their 50s. So I'm saying, and it's mercurial. It moved up so fast that I didn't even see it coming. And this wasn't that long ago. Okay? This was in 2002. So my point here is, while I'm in full agreement that there needs to be a lot more opening up of space for discussion, I am not in favor of an open debate where anyone can walk in with whatever agenda and insight. I'm not in favor. You may disagree with me, but I stand firmly. I don't think we are ready for it because it can cause more harm than good. But there needs to be a lot more discussions in closed door. A lot more and larger groups, and we need to keep it building, we need to keep building it so that at some point we are ready for open discussions.
Okay, so there were so many questions that I think I will just try to work backwards from you, sir. I actually really cannot ask more about this. What you're really asking is the PAP padding its vote and its support by bringing in particular type of people, right? There's definitely evidence to prove that maybe they are, because these people do support their policies very much so. They come from a particular class. I'm not so sure about from China, but they definitely come from a particular upper middle class from India, which sees India as corrupt, and sees Singapore as not corrupt, and therefore Singapore is the holy land compared to India and things like that. So they come here and they see the cleanliness and the efficiency, and so they think that Singapore's awesome, and yay, that's for the PAP, because that's why Singapore is awesome. So my answer to that is I'm not sure. I really cannot say either way. But is there a new solidarity amongst Singaporeans? I think yes, but it's a really weird solidarity. It's xenophobic to begin with, which is horrible and not a way to build solidarity in any shape or form. And I think it's interesting to me because in a way, for the first time ever, I started seeing comments online about how, especially from Chinese Singaporeans, the Indians and the Malays are our brothers, So there's a sudden co-optation of us into the fight against the foreign hordes. So I think the solidarity is actually kind of fake. It's you now have a common enemy, and so now you want to be friends. And I think, I'm not so sure, because this is almost unprovable, but if they didn't exist, if the idea of the other as the foreigner, who's here to take your women and your jobs, didn't exist, will we then have the solidarity? I don't think so. But again, who knows? Let's move back. Okay, so, yeah, who do I talk about? Oh, okay, fine. So Vanessa, you gave the example of how there are more Indian and Malay women, and in the new generation of sex workers, there are no Chinese women, right? So to me, this is actually a really, what are the two, reasoning here, okay? Either there's something about Indian and Malay women, they are less able to work hard, they are less able to be educated. What is it? Is there something that's innate to them? and that's why they are sex workers and not Chinese women, especially of this generation? Or is it that there is an actual systematic discrimination enacted against them in Singapore? Okay. Vivian, eugenics, yes, awesome question. So, I think it's really interesting. You talked about it as the fundamental reason. I would disagree. I don't think it's the fundamental reason, but I think it's definitely a huge part of like all of these policies. Of course, we all, okay, I'm not going to say we all know, but we do know Lee Kuan Yew's statements about how if you put 3 women in the hospital, the East Asian would survive, the Malay would die, and the Indian woman would take a longer time to, right? So these eugenics ideas definitely have filtered down, and I think you make a really good point about how supposedly neutral governmental organizations are incredibly ideological, right? And it's not just about race, it's incredibly ableist, it's ridiculously ableist towards people who are physically and mentally disabled, you know? And these people are completely shunted aside and everything. But again, I need to also point out that, like, a lot of it has to do with poverty and class, you know? Like, there are people who are of a much higher class who are possibly physically disabled, but you know, they have access to certain things that people of a lower class do not, right? So I think these things are always really intersecting privileges and discrimination. So I actually 95% agree with you. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, what did you ask?
How does
We're almost out of time.
Okay.
Pretty much out of time,
Okay.
actually. So
So
if I
should
can
I-
continue. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm very sorry, but we're out of time and our guests have to rush to the airport. So I'm going to have to call it to a halt, but thank you all very much for your questions and for a great discussion. So please join me in thanking our panel.